Tonight, we turn our attention to the subject of NDEs, near-death experiences, and we welcome Dr. Scott Taylor, the President and Executive Director of the Monroe Institute. His vision for Monroe is its expanded global distinction as the world's go-to organization for exploring human consciousness. Taylor earned business degrees from Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and the Kellogg Graduate School of Business at Northwestern University. He earned a Minister of Spiritual Counseling degree from the New Seminary, New York City, and a doctorate in educational leadership from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he studied and wrote about the insights gained from persons who have had near-death experiences. I'm going to welcome Dr. Taylor on right now, but I also just want to remind you to please use the Q&A option to direct your questions to tonight's speaker. And also in the chat function, I've put the link for the Monroe Institute if you want to check out Dr. Taylor's website. Dr. Taylor?
Hey, thank you, Claire. I appreciate that introduction. I didn't realize how much time I spent at school. That's, oh dear. And welcome everyone. I'm really glad that you're able to join us this evening. And I've got a couple of notes before I begin. This presentation is going to be in 3 distinct parts. The first part is going to be a story about my cousin Kathy, and we'll pause after that, take a couple of questions, and then we'll talk about the Monroe Institute and how our work has been informed by near-death experiencers and the kinds of things that happened to Kathy. And the third, smaller section will be about the research that we're doing at the Monroe Institute. I think it's kind of cool, and I think you might think so too. Thank you, Gary Gilman. I appreciate the invitation this evening, and for Claire and Chris to help me out with technology and make sure that this all happens nice and smoothly. Those of you who attend the Vail Symposium, you're in good hands. So let's do the story about my cousin Kathy. Late on a Saturday night, my uncle PJ called me, and he told me that my cousin Kathy was in hospice and that she was dying of cancer and she wasn't going to be making it very much longer. She wasn't doing well. And no matter what drugs they gave her, it just didn't seem to cut the pain. And at the same time, Kathy's desire was not to be, drugged into oblivion. So there was this dance of what made her comfortable and how we could make this transition go easily. But that really wasn't the focus of his call. He said, Scott, more importantly, Kathy is afraid of dying. He said, no, let me rephrase that. Kathy is terror. She's in terror about process of dying. He says, and I know you know this death stuff. So would you mind going to see her and talking about what her transition might be like? I said, well, of course, PJ, sure, I'll go. And I'll go tomorrow. So on Sunday, I made the way over to the hospice. And it's true, I do know a lot about near-death experiences. Back in the early 80s, I had one myself. About 20 years later, I graduated with my doctorate, and the study, the focus of my studies was on near-death experiences. And I've been the MC at the IONS conference for the last dozen years or so. And I teach a course at the Monroe Institute that's centered around near-death experiences. So I do know a lot about that. But what I didn't know about was the process of dying and the work those gentle people do at hospice. So when I arrived, I went to the nurse's station, checked in with the nurse, and she gave me an update on where Kathy was. And at that moment, she says, Kathy's in a lot of pain right now. So when you go into the room, I'm going to go with you, and let's the two of us get her comfortable so that you can have a good talk together. Okay, we did it. So into the room we went. We got her comfortable. And when the nurse left, I sat down with Kathy and I asked her, I said, Kathy, do you remember me? Because I really didn't know where her head was and what kind of cognitive ability she had. And she said, oh, yes, absolutely. When you and Ann were married, I was at your house at the reception. And yesterday, PJ and Audrey came to visit me. And they said that there was a high likelihood that you would be calling on me today. So, yes, of course I remember you. So I paused and said, Kathy, what is it that you're scared about? Would you like to talk about dying, because I might be able to help? And what she said to me was nothing. She just shook her head and said, no. So I said, Kathy, I've been where you're going, and it's exquisite. It is absolutely wonderful. And again, she responded with a shake of her head and said, no, I can't talk about that. It's just too difficult. Okay, so let's talk about something else. And so we talked about family. And the way it works is that my grandmother and her grandfather were siblings. And so that's how we're in the cousins thing. And so we talked about the relatives that we had and the relatives I've never met, because my grandmother was one of 12. So I got a whole raft of cousins that I have met and a raft that I haven't met. So we talked about that for a while, and she became more and more comfortable. In a pause in our conversation, I tried again. I said, Kathy, can you tell me about being afraid? And she said, no, it's just too hard. So the television happened to be on in the room, and on the television was a professional football game. The Vikings were playing. And we're sitting there watching this game, and I'm thinking to myself, this is probably the second or third most important thing that will ever happen in her life. And we're sitting here watching a football game. In the course of human events, this is like so inconsequential. And on top of that, we're watching the Vikings. And those of you that know professional football, they always lose. They have broken my heart since I was a kid. So, like, no, I don't want to do this. Well, after a little bit, she wound up being in pain again. And so I went out and got the nurse, brought her back in, and see if we could relieve her discomfort for a while. And while she was doing that, this thought came to me. And when the nurse left, I turned to Kathy and said, when you die, the pain immediately leaves you. It immediately goes. And that's when Kathy really looked at me for the first time. It was my signal, this nonverbal communication, that I should go on. I said, dying is as easy as taking your next breath. You don't have to think about it any more than you would think about placing your feet one in front of the other as you walk. She nodded her head. And when you leave your physical body, the experience, it's amazing. It's extraordinary. There is so much love. Now I need to pause here for just a second to tell you that at this part of my presentation, there are some really important quotes, and I'm going to be looking at my notes here so I get the languaging just right, because I think it's really impactful. So again, I said, there is so much love. And she nodded and said, pause. And then I continued and I said, and you have help. There will be somebody there to guide you to the light, somebody who loves you. And this was the most deep and penetrating look that I have had maybe in my life. It was extraordinary. Her desire to know transcended the pain. And for a moment, it was forgotten. And she said, I can have help? Finally, Kathy's talking. This is great. You'll have a guide to take you to the light. You don't need to do this alone. And she said, that would be nice. I've been alone so much in my life. I would like to have a guide that loved me. Kathy, you know you can choose. You know you can choose who your guide is going to be. Who would you like to come and pick you up? And there's this brilliant smile that was on her face. And without a second's hesitation, she said, Uncle Ben. Pause. Well, and Aunt Muriel too. So I know that hesitation was for propriety's sake, but clearly it was Uncle Ben with which she had a heart connection and was her first choice. Wonderful. I said, Uncle Ben it is. And she kind of gave me this quizzical look and she goes, well, how can we make that happen? I said, we just did. Kathy, when we were talking, did you see in your mind Uncle Ben standing next to the bed and picking you up out of your physical body? And she looked at me and she said, well, yeah, yes, I did. All right. The invitation has been sent. It was that simple. I know he loved you. I know he loved you dearly, and he wouldn't miss the opportunity to be there for you. I know that he would consider it to be his highest honor. He'll be there for you, and you know that. And with confidence, her shoulders straightened a little bit, and she said, yes, I do. I know that he will be there for me. Then just as soon, there was this darkness that covered her face. And she looked at me and said, Scott, what if I've been bad? And then with this explosion of emotion, she said, what if I can't get into heaven? I looked at her and went, Kathy, do you love your children? And she kind of looked at me and says, well, of course, I'm confused by that. Have they ever done something wrong or that was hurtful? Ah, she's getting where I'm going. She says, well, of course they have. And did you love them any less? Seeing where I was going, she said, no, of course not. And then darkness. This time it's even more deep. It's covering her face. And she says, and her voice starts to quiver. And there's a look of terror on her face. But what if I've been mean on purpose? And I asked her, what did you learn about being mean? She said, it was awful. It always brought more pain. Even when I wanted to hurt somebody because they had hurt me, I learned I was the one who was really hurt. And I responded, God's like that. God understands that we are imperfect, that we're here to try to find our way in this world that is so different from heaven. And sometimes we don't do it perfectly. We are always part of God's family. And when you leave your physical body, the pain stops. You get to be with Uncle Ben again, and you get to experience the most amazing, wonderful love. It just wraps itself around you. It infuses the very essence with love. And you get to merge back into that love again. Kathy, this is God welcoming you home. It's God telling you that you have lived a most amazing life. All of the wonder, the hurt, the love, the disappointment, the patience and understanding that come from living in the physical is a great gift. Rejoice in that gift. And you could see her countenance change and the relief on her face. At this point, I said, you know, Kathy, there's a party. She looked at me and said, what? She said, there's a party. A party? Yeah, When Uncle Ben comes and picks you up out of your physical body and takes you to the light, when you get there, you get to be greeted by your friends and your relatives that have all made their transition ahead of you. They have been waiting. They have been waiting for you and have arranged a party. A party, she says. Yes, just for you, in your honor. It's a welcome home party. Who do you want to invite? And she looks at me and goes, what? Well, you get to choose Uncle Ben to be the person that takes you to the light. So you get to choose who do you want at your party? Well, I said, this is interesting. Okay. Um, well, of course, we want Uncle Ben there. And then we spent probably, I don't know, the next 10 minutes and we're ticking down, the list of relatives that have made their transition already. Okay, so there's Jenny and Paul and Fred and Mary. And then there's my friends next door. And she goes, and we really flesh out a really nice invitation list. And then at the end, she kind of goes, can I invite my pets? Because I have some pets that I really loved. I said, of course you can invite your pets. They'll be there too. Wonderful. Now, Scott, do I have to do anything special like I did with Uncle Ben? I said, nope. When we were discussing with the invitation list, you had in your mind an image of them or a heartfelt sensation of who they were. They're invited. It's that easy. Guaranteed they'll be there. They'll show up. I want to pause here for just a second to say, we've learned things about near-death experiences and what happens between those of us in the physical world and those that are in the non-physical world. And what Kathy was doing right then was that every time that she thought of somebody who was a dearly departed relative, there was this heart sensation. She would remember how she felt about them. And what we know from the research is that there is this bridge that's instantly built between us, so it's a heart bridge, heart to heart, between us and, say, Uncle Ben. And that heart bridge is immediately reciprocated. It's that fast. And so what was happening was that as we were going through the invitation list, she was connecting in a heart's way with every single member of in her pod, if we can use a COVID term. Every single member that she had ever loved, she was making a connection to, and they in return were making a connection back to her. So the more people she talked about, the more people that she envisioned, the more love that she was basking in. She got to plan that, and she got to be in that feeling again. There was this sense of anticipation, looking forward to being in the love of her friends and relatives all at the same time. It was overwhelming her with love and acceptance. This is one of the rules about near-death experiencers. You aren't judged. And so she got to be in this unconditional love, in this space where she was accepted again. So on we continue. So Kathy, this party, where do you want this party to be? And without a second's hesitation, she says, I want it in a park, and I don't want to invite any bugs. Okay, it's in a park. That's great. All right, so once it's in a park, what do you want? Do you want it inside or outside in this park? So you want it outside. Great. Do you want it in the trees or do you want it in the meadow? So, I want it right on the edge between the two of them, because that'll be fun. You look out one way and it's the woods, and the other way it'll be a field and it's full of flowers. Say, wonderful. Tent or no tent? Oh, I want a tent. That'd be great. Okay, how about tables? Card tables or picnic tables? Absolutely picnic tables. And on top of that, on those picnic tables, I don't want a tablecloth. What I want is a runner that goes the length of the picnic table. And on that runner, there's stripes of primary colors. And in the middle of each one of those picnic tables, I want a small vase of flowers, brightly colored flowers that exactly match the stripes on the runner. I said, that would be so much fun. Okay. Got flowers. How about music? And she goes, oh, I really like guitar music. So yes, I want a guitar player softly in the background, playing soft. No singing, no singing, softly in the background. Okay. How about games? Would you like to play games during your party? And she looks at me like, no, I don't want to play games. She says, I haven't seen these people for a really long time. And I would like the time to catch up with them without being distracted by games. So this is our time to be together. So that's great. All right, we can do that. Food. What do you want? And she said, oh, got to have picnic food. Now, I grew up in Minnesota. Kathy lived in Minnesota. So picnic food has a very singular connotation, but I had to check. So when you say, Kathy, picnic food, what do you mean? Well, it's either hot dogs or hamburgers. People get to choose. Great. And I want baked beans with that piece of fat in them. And I want potato salad, and I want coleslaw, the kind of the vinegary kind. I said, all right, that's great. And then all of a sudden her face got kind of dark again. And she started looking down and she goes, Scott? I said, what, Kathy? What's concerning you? Can I have beer? So of course you can have beer. You can have anything you want at your party. This is just great. So she, brightened up, and we laughed about how this party was going to go. We talked about the kinds of conversations that she would have, and then she looked at me and she said, oh, Scott, you've worn me out. I'm really tired. Would you please leave? I said, well, of course, Kathy, glad to. And so I reached over, and gave her a kiss on the cheek, and we said our goodbyes. And she laid down to take a nap. She never woke up from that nap. She died sometime early the next morning. And I have to think that she died with a smile on her face. The same smile that was on her face when I left her at the hospice. I have to believe that our talk had made a real difference for her, and that she had a wonderful transition and just the most wonderful welcoming home party. So I told you this story for a couple of reasons. The first was to share with you how Kathy overcame her fear of being damned by focusing on the love that she had for her Uncle Ben, for her friends, for her relatives, for her pets. She basked in the shower of love that they gave her. She merged with that love and really began to look forward at that space of being with her special people. Secondly, she also reframed that experience in the physical of that of parent and child, so that she could understand the universal love that is appropriate between parent and child. The third reason I told this story is for you, because I didn't know how to work with a person that was in hospice or in the process of dying, but I do know about near-death experience. What I told Kathy was absolutely true. I know it because I know the topic of near-death experience so well that when called upon, I could improvise. So my challenge to you today is to do the same. We all know something really well. Each of us has a gift in some area. So whether it's softball or knitting or flying kites or raising chickens, it almost doesn't matter. However, at some point in our lives, we will be put in a situation where what we know will be of vital importance to someone else. And I'm also guessing that that situation might require you to do a little tap dancing to make it work. It will require of us to be courageous, to confront our own fears of inadequacy. Like Moses in the Hebrew Bible, he was not a great speaker or a leader, but God told him that he would put words in his mouth. Moses was an instrument of God's love. We must play the same role. We must get out of our own way to be the gift to someone in need. That's our challenge. God will help. And I have a sneaking suspicion that Kathy will be there too. So this is a pause. We're at the end of part one of my talk. Anybody have some questions for me?
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you for sharing that very personal story with us. So one of the questions is really a question to ask you to take a step back and give us some context of how you knew what you were saying to your cousin, Kathy. What did it come primarily from your own near-death experience, or was it a combination of factors?
Ah, that's great. Great question. Thank you. Um, it comes from a whole series of things. One, certainly, I had a near-death experience. Mine happened to be one of those rare shared death experiences. So it gave me a different perspective. And secondly, in the course of doing my academic work, I interviewed probably 30 people who'd had near-death experiences, and I interviewed them at some depth, 2 to 4 hours. So we really got into what it means to be in a near-death experience, and we teased out some of this information. And since I started my research back in the mid 1990s, I've been a member of IANS, and I've had the privilege of being the MC at their international conferences. So over the years, I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people that have had near-death experiences, and they've told me their stories, and I've had a chance to question them in casual settings, like over lunch or sitting at breaks, that sort of thing. Those are incredibly valuable conversations. And then, of course, I teach courses around near-death experiences at the Monroe Institute, where I'm with people for a week. And about half the people that attend those courses have had near-death experiences. So we get into some really interesting conversations. So it's a combination of my personal experience, my academic experience, and having the privilege of interviewing a ton of people over the years.
In all of your interviews, have you ever encountered anybody who had a bad near-death experience? I'm asking for a friend.
Yes. Yes, I have. And it's interesting because people who've had near-death experience, in the literature, it's called a less than positive near-death experience. And they are doubly reluctant to come forth. One is that, the image that's out there is that all near-death experiences are wild and wonderful. And that's not true. And secondly, they are feeling like they don't want to expose themselves by telling their story because there might be something wrong with them or something bad or whatever. So they're like in a double whammy situation. And the truth is that we know that near-death experiences, those that have near a less than positive one, are they come for all kinds of reasons. The big one is that it's a whack alongside of the head. And the purpose of it is to say, you know, Mary, Fred, you're not living the life that you were supposed to live. It isn't what you wanted to do. You're not living life to the fullest. Here's what you need to do to kind of clean up your life a little bit. We're going to put you in a situation where you have to really look at what you have created. So although it may be an unpleasant experience at the time, it is incredibly valuable when they come back into the physical world and they start to live their life and they get to see the patterns that they have created and now can do some really meaningful work on creating those. There's also another, for those of you that are familiar with the hero's journey, there is a part in the hero's journey where you have to confront the other. There's the trial, and it's a part of you that says, okay, I'm ready to be tested. And so they are tested in their near-death experience. And also that winds up being something that they learn from and can really enhance not only their spiritual life, but their non-physical life as well. And then there's a third category, which is, I don't know. Some people just have a bad experience, and you know, when you talk to them about it, it's like, I don't get it either. And I think we have to be okay with that until something bubbles up and something surfaces that gives us insight. So I have to say, as a researcher, there's that segment. There are two very wonderful books that were published, that were written by Nancy Evans Bush, specifically on less than positive near-death experiences. And so your friend, please have them pick those up because they are extraordinary. They really speak in a heartfelt way to what it means to go through that kind of experience.
Okay, so I have a comment and another question. Kim just wanted to let you know that your story parallels her own hospice experience with her dad, and that it was confirmed a month later by a medium who channeled the speaker. And then Catherine Wilson has two questions. The first question is, what happens and what are the levels after this welcoming party and going through the light? And then the second question is, how connected are people who've passed to those that are still living?
I'm going to answer the second question first, because the first question is at the very beginning of part 2 of my conversation. So we're going to get right into what those levels are. This person is prescient. Well done. But I'm sorry. The second question was,
how connected are people?
Oh, yes. How connected?
With those that are still living?
We're like that far apart. They are so present, so connected all the time that, you know, you've heard that expression that the veil is very thin. And especially if you've had a near-death experience, it's even thinner. But if you've done deep meditation practices, you can pick up on that. So yes, it's incredibly thin. And sometimes people on the other side can make themselves known, and sometimes they don't. They adjust their energy pattern so that they aren't so present in people's lives. And you know, that was very helpful for me when I lost somebody that was very close to me, and and I could tell that she was present for a while, and then she changed her vibration and wasn't, and that was to give me healing. So, but it doesn't mean they're not there. It means they're fully present, but you know, there's a dance the two of you have to do. Oh, I'm thinking I should head off into part 2 here.
All right, check back in with me when you're looking for more questions.
Okay, will do. All right. Oh, there we go. So I was called to help Kathy because I knew about this near-death stuff. And it's true. And one of the gifts from having studied near-death experiences and interviewing near-death experiencers is that there is now a pretty clear roadmap of the non-physical universe that has been given to us by the millions of people that have had near-death experiences. And in the language of academic NDE research, this is known as common elements. And this is a term that came from Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. That book was the very first book in a public way that talked about NDEs, published in 1975. And so they are, there's 19 of these common elements, and I'm not going to read them all to you, but there are some in here that I think you'll recognize from Kathy's story. So the sensation of a total peace and well-being, moving through a long dark tunnel, feeling that one's consciousness has been detached from the physical body, and or viewing one's own physical body as a spectator, meeting the spirits of loved ones or those that you have previously known, friends, meeting and appearing before a being of light, and in the presence of this being of light, undergoing a three-dimensional panoramic life review, visiting the cities of light, and having come back, undergoing value changes in your life and experiencing a change in attitude about death. And essentially what that means in layman's terms is you're not afraid to die. That whole process, that doesn't bother you. It's just, in fact, you can look forward to it. So those are some of the more common elements of a near-death experience. So when you mix these common elements together, you can see how they might provide a possible journey for one's own transition, excuse me. And Raymond Moody cautioned us in his book. He said, you know, every near-death experience is different. And there isn't any specific order, but there tends to be an order. And especially that near-death experiences seem to be crafted for the individual. So it is designed to help you have an experience that is appropriate for you, that you will bring back with you into the physical world. So you learned in my introduction that I'm currently serving as the president and executive director of the Monroe Institute, located in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains, about 40 minutes southwest of Charlottesville. And I want to tell you a little bit about Monroe so I can help draw the connection between what Kathy did, trading fear for grace, and what we're doing at the Monroe Institute. So background. Back in the 1950s, Bob Monroe was a traditional media guy. He worked as the vice president of the Mutual Broadcasting System. Pause. That's him right there. That's Bob Monroe. I hung him on the wall for you so you could see who he was. He had a flair for the dramatic. Isn't that a great picture? Anyway, so in the 50s, he started having spontaneous out-of-body experiences. And you have to remember now, this is the 50s. There were no conferences about near-death experiences. There were no documentary. There were no movies. Soap opera stars hadn't had near-death experiences. And for goodness sake, Harry Potter, probably the most famous near-death experience on the planet, he hadn't had his yet either. So this just wasn't available. It wasn't part of the culture. He felt adrift and alone. And as you can imagine, at first he was terrified of this experience, and he feared that he had some grave illness or that he was dying, or worse, he was going crazy. So he had himself checked out stem to stern, and it turns out he was in great health. All systems were functioning normally. Then it hit him. With those concerns behind him, curiosity got the better of him, and he began to study in earnest the potential of this new skill, because he kept asking himself, what good could this be? What could we do with this out-of-body state that would be really extraordinary? And he spent the better part of a decade exploring what you could do and learn in the out-of-body state. And along the way, he invented and patented an enhanced audio technology that we now call the Monroe Audio Support that could help him enter into and hold these expanded states of awareness. I'm telling you all this because Bob Monroe became famous for the tools and techniques he created for exploring these expanded states of awareness. He wrote about it in 3 books, starting with Journeys Out of the Body. He wrote that covered the decade of the 70s. Ultimate Journey covered the 80s, and his 3rd book covered the 90s. I'm having a brain fart here at the moment. I'm sorry. Far Journeys was the 2nd one, and Ultimate Journeys was the 3rd one, and they each covered a decade of his life. And what I really respect about the man was in each one of those books, he described where he was at the moment. And he had the courage in his 2nd book to say, remember what I told you in the 1st one? Not so much. And in that 3rd book, he'd say, you know what I told you in the 2nd one and the 1st one? I've rethought that because I've had different experiences. And he went on to explain what his evolving knowledge was of the non-physical universe. It's a terrific testament to an explorer who had his mind open to being changed with the addition of new information. So what he found, he documented and he put it into a system. And what he created for us was a map of the non-physical universe. And that tool in itself is really quite extraordinary. And what happened is that this map was remarkably similar to what was described by Raymond Moody in his book, Life After Life. So what Bob did is he named the expanded states of consciousness he encountered focus levels, each one having distinct qualities and characteristics. And in an interesting quirk of fate, Bob describes something which he calls Focus 27. He nicknamed it the Park. And that's exactly the same language that near-death researchers describe that area of life between lives. In the literature, it is also called the Park. And here we have 2 people who are exploring the non-physical universe, and it stands to reason that they would encounter some of the same places. And this is probably the most famous one. And because they called it exactly the same thing. And this all happened at about the same time. You know, Bob's book came out in 1971, Raymond Moody's came out in 1975. And it's 2 different, very different groups of people, 2 very different looks at the world, near-death experiencers and out-of-body experiences. And the result was that they're relatively similar. So the question that came to me was, do you have to have a traumatic event of an NDE in order to create and initiate the experience? And it turns out there is a kinder, gentler way. And yes, you can use Monroe's meditation techniques, his tools and techniques, to explore the common elements, such things as the out-of-body experience. We talked about that. That's in both of those systems. Meeting your guide, the tunnel, meeting the dead relatives, meeting your teacher protector, meeting that being of life, having a life review, and then moving on and exploring the cities of light. And in that cities of light, there's the reception center, the healing and regeneration center, the hall of records, some call it the Akashic records, universities, professional centers, it goes on and on. If you have an interest, there is a spot for you there. You're interested in landscaping, there's a spot where people study landscaping in a very serious way. So one of the after effects we know about near-death experiences is that those who have them lose their fear of death. Just like Kathy did. By understanding her journey, she lost her fear of death. And why not? I mean, it's an extraordinarily loving experience. And it turns out that using Monroe's meditation techniques and visiting the same places as near-death experiencers go to, the same thing happens, that you lose your fear of death. And of course, that's why the why is because the trip is in your hands and you are under control. You can determine for yourself what your transition will look like, what it will feel like, when and how you want to experience it. So it's one of those wonderful gifts that we can give ourselves to lose that fear of death. And once you know, now I'm not talking believe is a head thing. Once you know in your heart, in every fiber of your being, you can lose the fear of death because you've been there. It's not a secret. It's not a mystery to be feared. Rather, it's a journey that you've taken many, many times before. And that is also turning fear into grace. So that's the end of part 2. Claire, what do you got for me?
Well, just a reminder, we're at about 11 minutes till the top of the hour.
Yep.
So Goldie has a question, and I was kind of wondering about the same thing. She asked that, or explains that in near-death experiences with somebody who shared their experience with her, that he felt that his wife was calling him back, and that while he was attracted to the light, he came back to be with her. And so do you hear reports of that? And you were just talking about that you're in control. And so I've been curious about this as well, is why do people come back? And do you control the coming back?
Very often you control coming back. And there's often a negotiation that happens with that being of light, and saying, okay, in my research, I interviewed just a raft of women who had died during childbirth. And to a person, they would appear before, if you're using the Christian perspective, they appeared before St. Peter. He had the big book, and he says, "It's time for you, Claire, to be here." And you go, that's just not happening. I'm going back because I have a brand new baby that needs me. Or I have children that need me. I have a husband, I have a wife, there is some real emotional tie, and there is choice involved, and you get to rewrite your contract sometimes. And so, yes, there is this ability to choose.
And then Randy has asked a question about comas. In the people you've spoken with or interviewed, have you found people in comas having similar experiences? And does it matter if they were in a coma as a result of an accident or if it was an induced coma for another reason?
That's a great question. People that are in comas that I have spoken with often have, well, the ones that I talk to have had near-death experience as a result of being in a coma. So their physical bodies were still alive in the non-physical, in the physical universe, but they had gone off into doing something else. And there's a whole kind of a mini segment of near-death research that talks about people that had no physical trauma, and that they were walking across the room and they left their body and had a near-death experience. It happens to mountain climbers when they fall off the mountain and they wind up landing in a pile of snow. They actually didn't hurt themselves, but they wanted to have, but they left their body. There's some really famous stories about soldiers in boot camp who thought they were going to die and so jumped out of their physical body. People just before car crashes will jump out of their physical body so they don't have to be there when the accident happened. And sometimes it just doesn't. So that's something that there's just all different kinds of flavors of that.
Well, I'm going to let you go into your third section. I just wanted to remind our audience, if you've got a question, type it into Q&A. I've seen a few people raising their hands, but we really would prefer a typed question in Q&A.
Okay. So this is part 3, and it's short, but I was asked by Chris and Claire to just touch on briefly some of the research that we're doing at the Monroe Institute in and around this area of consciousness, because that's what we're known for. We're known as consciousness explorers and consciousness researchers. The first one is on the human energy field. What is it? How do we measure it? What's it comprised of? And how can you direct it so that it's that in a way that you can measure it? Really interesting. Another one is what we're calling the discovery data. We have a program called Discovery where we hook people up to EEGs, and then we ask them to do a particular task. And the one that we're working on right now is remote viewing. So you're in the class, we've asked you to go in the other room and tell us what's on the table. And so they're non-physical, so they go into their remote viewing mode, and if they get a hit, a 5 out of 5 star hit, we mark that and watch what happens on the EEG data. And what we're seeing, interestingly enough, is that the brainwave patterns tend to go flat. It's like the brain just kind of slows way down, and those waves just kind of disappear that are on the EEG. And that's when we figure what it is that we're getting out of our own way, and then other information can come in without the filter of our physical brains. Third is we have a program called MC Squared, and it's about manifestation and how we use this energy in the physical world. So we've set up a shielded box with 6 sensors inside, and we ask our participants to try to light up the sensors that are on the inside of this shielded box. And we're getting some really incredible, great results from that. We're also testing a 3 hertz signal using spatial angle modulation. That's when sound waves kind of move back and forth in that manner. And we want to see if it has a brain driving effect. And that's seems like a harsh word, but yes, it excites the brain in a way that is very predictable, and we can use that in our Monroe audio technology to enhance people's experiences of the non-physical. And the last one, we just finished building. Raymond Moody, in his first book, Life After Life, talked about this thing called a psychomantium. And then later in some of his papers, he did research on it. And it's a room that's dark, there's a mirror. And if you sit in a recliner, look at the mirror, it reflects back onto a black screen. And people who've used psychomantiums said that they are able to see deceased loved ones with their physical eyes. So if they look into the mirror, and they can actually see those people that have made their transition and have conversations with them. So it just got built. I tried it for the first time about a week ago, and nothing yet, but it was the first time.
All right, we've got several more questions, and a couple of people are asking about suicide attempts and whether or not you've had some conversations with people who've had an NDE when they were attempting suicide, and how was that same? How was it different?
Flip side, I actually haven't had enough conversations with suicide attempts that I'd be confident to tell you, but I have on the other end, which is I've had several conversations, several, of people who were in their NDE and say, be like Kathy, they're at the party in the tent, and who's grilling the burgers? It's their brother who committed suicide.
Mm.
And so that sense of condemnation that we tend to associate with near-death experiences is not there. That judgment around it is not there. But what we do know is that it's a complicated question, because maybe that was part of the contract that they came in with, that they were going to have such severe bipolar that they couldn't take it. But on the other hand, there is this ethic out there that says that being here in the physical life is such a gift, and that we shouldn't waste that gift, and that there is much to be learned from undergoing the trials and tribulations of this life in the physical. And so that suicide is not the answer, and yet it's also not condemned, not in the way we think about it. No.
So I don't know if you were aware, but this week Netflix released a series called Surviving Death. There's 6 episodes. The
Mm-hmm.
first one is on NDEs, and the 6th one is on reincarnation. And I'm so glad Louise asked a question about your thoughts on reincarnation, because I was kind of thinking the same thing, that do these things support one another? Are they two sides of the same coin? Does one, prove the other? What are your thoughts on reincarnation as related to NDEs? And this is probably the last question we'll have time for.
Okay, I see we got just a couple minutes left. Um, I found in my research that there is a process that we go through when we come into the physical world. There's a group, I call them the Council of Friends, that helps us organize and design the life that we are here. I pick my parents, I pick my siblings, I pick the kind of experiences that I'm to have in this physical world. And excuse me, and then I'm launched into this physical world with a set of tools that is specific for what it is that I want to get accomplished when I'm here. And that um, is, and then free will takes over. I mean, you can choose to follow your path, you can choose not to follow your path. And then there's people who are interrupted, say, with a near-death experience, and you get to go back to the Council of Friends and go, "Hey, how am I doing?" And they're going, "You're doing great." Or, "Oh man, Taylor, shape up. You know, you wanted to get this accomplished, and you are not. You are so not on the path." And it's this wonderful, loving group of entities that support us. And here's the last thing, is that when you think about reincarnation, remember that all of this happens outside of time and space. And so when we have a life, all of our lives are happening simultaneously. And so each gets to inform the other. If you enter into these meditative practices, that is a wonderful way to think about how we grow in wisdom. It's because all of us is informing all of us. So with that, thank you, Claire. And thank you, everybody who's been listening. Really
Dr.
been a joy.
Taylor, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. Everyone at home, thank you for joining us this evening. And I hope you'll join us next week on the 21st. We welcome Patrick Reasonover for a Q&A about the documentary, They Say It Can't Be Done. I urge you to go ahead and register for that if you're interested. That's the only way you'll get a link for that program, because it's not streaming on Netflix or anywhere else at this time. It's a fascinating documentary on real solutions to real world problems and the problem of bureaucratic red tape that they're running into. That's on January 21st. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Good night.